Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, 1944. A German Tiger I tank stands on American soil, captured in Tunisia, shipped across the Atlantic, and what American engineers are about to discover will shake them to their core. The test results were immediately classified, buried for 50 years. Today, I'm going to show you what the Pentagon didn't want you to know, the complete story of the Tiger tests, and why America had to completely rewrite its tank doctrine. Let's start at the beginning. April 1943, Tunisia. The British 48th Royal Tank Regiment is battling German tanks near a place called Gueriat El Attach. A Tiger I from the Heavy Tank Battalion 501 takes a hit. 3 shots from 6-pounder guns. One strikes the gun barrel. The shot deflects, jamming the turret. The crew bails out. What remains is the first intact Tiger I in Allied hands, Tiger 131. The British know what they have, a prize beyond measure. They repair the tank using parts from other destroyed Tigers. They present it to Winston Churchill and King George VI. Then the tests begin. The School of Tank Technology in Chobham completely disassembles Tiger 131. Every part is measured, every weld is analyzed, every alloy is tested. What they find is unsettling. The armor, 100 millimeters on the front, but not just any steel, hardened Krupp steel with a special surface treatment. It takes British experts weeks to even begin to understand the metallurgy. The ATT Metamegun, the KWK-36, electrically fired, as precise as a sniper rifle. The British fire test shots, and they can't believe it. 5 consecutive hits on a 16 by 18-inch target from 4,000 feet away. No British tank could do that. But the British share their findings with the Americans. And the Americans want to conduct their own tests. That's why a Tiger now sits in Aberdeen. Aberdeen Proving Ground, founded in 1917, the U.S. Army's oldest testing ground. Every American weapon was tested here. Every captured enemy vehicle was analyzed. And here begins the story that was kept secret for 50 years. The U.S. Army brings in more than just the Tiger. They bring in Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, Panthers, everything they'd captured on the battlefield. But the Tiger is the star. The Tiger is what the generals are most interested in. And the Tiger is what scares them the most. The first tests are firing trials. The Americans want to know what their weapons can do against the Tiger's armor. They start with the 75mm gun from the Sherman tank, standard armament of American armored forces. They fire from different distances, 600 feet, 1,000 feet, 300 feet. The result? Devastating. The 75mm bounces off the Tiger's front armor at every distance. The Sherman cannot engage the Tiger frontally. The armor is too thick, the steel is too hard. Then they try the 76mm, the new, improved gun. The weapon specifically designed to fight heavy German tanks. The result? Only marginally better. The 76mm penetrates the Tiger's front only from less than 1,600 feet, and even then, not reliably. Penetration depends on the angle of impact, on the quality of the ammunition, on factors a tanker can't control. In the heat of battle, the generals in Washington are worried, very worried, because now they're testing the Tiger's gun against American tanks. The 18mm KWK-36 is loaded. A Sherman is set up as a target. The distance, 6,500 feet, over a mile. A distance from which no Sherman can return fire. The shot is fired. The Sherman explodes. The 88mm tears through the Sherman's armor like paper. The armor-piercing core rips through the vehicle. Fuel ignites. Ammunition detonates. The observers take notes, a lot of notes. They repeat the test, this time from 5,000 feet. Same result, from 3,000 feet. The Sherman doesn't stand a chance. Then they test the Tiger's armor against American anti-tank rockets, against bazookas, against everything the infantry has. The 2.36-inch bazooka, standard weapon of the American infantry, against tanks. It penetrates the Tiger's side armor, sometimes at a perfect angle. The front, impossible. The reports pile up, page after page of technical data, and every page tells the same story. The Tiger is superior to American tanks in every way. The gun is stronger. The armor is thicker. The optics are better. The fire control system is more precise. The only drawback, speed. The Tiger is slower than the Sherman, but in a direct duel, that doesn't matter. In a direct duel, the Tiger wins every time. And here comes the part that was kept secret for 50 years. The reports went to Washington, the generals read them, and they make a decision. This information cannot be released. Why? Because it would undermine morale. American tank crews are fighting in Europe. Thousands of them. They're sitting in Shermans. They believe their tanks are good enough. What would happen if they knew that the Tiger could kill them from over a mile away? That their guns couldn't penetrate the Tiger's front armor? That they're practically committing suicide if they engage a Tiger head-on? Morale would collapse. Losses would increase. The war would last longer. So, the reports are classified, restricted, secret, for selected eyes only, and the tank crews. They find out nothing. They keep fighting. They keep dying. But let me show you the numbers. The numbers the Pentagon didn't want you to see. The 3rd Armored Division, one of the best American armored units, they begin the Normandy campaign with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. In 11 months, they lose 648 Shermans in combat. Another 700 are so badly damaged, they have to be repaired. 648 destroyed, with a starting strength of 232. That's a cumulative loss rate of 580%. The average crew casualty rate per destroyed tank, 0.98 killed or wounded. Do the math. 648 times 0.98. That's over 600 men killed or wounded in a single division. And why? Because their tanks were inferior, because their leadership knew the truth, but suppressed it, because political considerations were placed above military realities. That's the price of secrecy. But it gets worse. The Americans had a solution, the M26 Pershing, a heavy tank with a 90mm cannon, a tank that was the Tiger's equal. The Pershing had been ready for deployment since September 1943, tested, approved, ready for production, but it wasn't deployed. Why? General Leslie McNair, the man who designed the tank destroyer doctrine, he believed that heavy tanks were unnecessary, that the tank destroyers would be sufficient. The Pershing remained in America. While American crews in Europe died in their Sherman tanks, it wasn't until February 1945 that the first Pershings reached Europe. A year and 5 months too late. Thousands of dead men too late. The Aberdeen reports could have changed that. They clearly showed that the Sherman tank was inferior. They clearly showed that a better solution was needed, but they were classified. And here we come to another aspect, one that is even less well known. The Germans knew what the Americans were testing. The Abwehr had agents in the USA. They had informants in the American arms industry. They knew that their Tigers were sitting in Aberdeen. And they knew what the tests would show. This gave them a psychological advantage. They knew that their tanks were superior. They knew that the Americans also knew it. But they also knew that the American crews didn't know it. That's asymmetric information in war. One side knows the truth, the other side dies because of it. But let me show you even more. The Tiger tests in Aberdeen weren't the only ones. The British conducted their own tests, with other weapons. With other methods, the 17-pounder, the strongest British tank cannon, they tested it against the Tiger's front armor from various distances. The result? Only the APDS ammunition could penetrate, and even that only under ideal conditions. APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, high-velocity ammunition with a tungsten carbide core. The most advanced ammunition the British had, and even IT struggled against the Tiger. The Soviets also tested. They captured Tigers on the Eastern Front. They shot at them with everything they had. 45mm ricochet, 57mm ricochet, 76mm, occasional penetration at short range, 85mm, penetration possible but not guaranteed, 122mm. Finally, the heavy cannon of the IS-2 could defeat the Tiger, but the IS-2 was rare. It was difficult to produce. It wasn't available for every engagement. Most Soviet tankers sat in T-34s, with a 76mm cannon. Practically powerless against Tigers, and they knew it. Unlike the Americans, the Soviet leadership didn't hide anything. Soviet crews knew that they had no chance against Tigers. They knew that they would die if they encountered one. That was brutally honest, but it was the truth. The American method was different. The American crews were kept in the dark. They believed their Shermans were good enough. They weren't. Now I come to the part of the story that came to light 50 years later, so 1995, the end of the Cold War. The American government begins to release old files. Thousands of documents are declassified, among them the Aberdeen reports. Historians begin to analyze them. What they find confirms what veterans have been saying for decades. The American leadership knew. They knew that the Sherman was inferior. They knew that better tanks were available. They knew that men would die. And they did nothing. The reports show detailed penetration tests. They show comparisons between American and German weapons. They show recommendations that were ignored. One recommendation stands out. From the engineers at Aberdeen, they recommend the immediate deployment of the M26 Pershing. They recommend the development of a 90mm cannon for the Sherman. They recommend improved armor. These recommendations were rejected by generals who had never sat in a tank, by bureaucrats who had never seen a battle, and young men paid the price. If you appreciate these historical truths and want to support my research, then use the Super Thanks feature below this video. Every contribution helps me to further document these forgotten stories. But let's get back to the story. What else did the Aberdeen report show? The welds. The German Tigers had an interesting problem. Their armor plates were excellent. Their Krupp steel was excellent. But their welds were vulnerable. The American testers found that with some hits, entire plates broke out of the armor. Not because the plates were penetrated, but because the welds failed. That was a weakness, a real weakness. But it was only relevant if you could even hit the Tiger in the first place. At the distances from which the Tiger fought, that was often impossible. A Tiger could fire at 2,000 meters. A Sherman could respond at maybe 800 meters. That means the Tiger had a 200-meter advantage, enough time to destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before they came into range. And that's exactly what happened in Europe. Again and again. Let me give you a specific example. Villers-Bocage, June 13, 1944. 1 week after D-Day, SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann sits in his Tiger. He's alone. His unit got lost. He's standing at a crossroads. In front of him, an entire British column, the 7th Armoured Division. The famous desert rats, Cromwell tanks, half-tracks, trucks, an entire brigade on the march. Whitman attacks, alone. In less than 15 minutes he destroys 14 half-tracks and 2 tanks. Then he drives into the town and destroys another 12 tanks. Cromwell's, Sherman's, a Sherman Firefly, 1 Tiger, 15 minutes, almost 30 enemy vehicles. The British could do nothing. Their 75mm cannons bounced off. Their Cromwells were too slow to escape. Their infantry had no heavy weapons. Whitman's Tiger was eventually stopped, a hit on the drivetrain. He had to flee on foot, but the damage was done. The British offensive was stopped for days because of a single Tiger. The Aberdeen testers knew this story. They understood what it meant, but they weren't allowed to talk about it, because what Villers-Bocage showed was clear. A single, well-commanded Tiger could stop an entire Allied division. Not through superiority in numbers, through superiority in technology. That was the lesson that no one was supposed to learn. But there were even more examples, many more. The Battle for Hill 112, July 1944. The British were trying to take a strategic hill. Tigers from the 102nd SS Heavy Tank Battalion were defending. The British lost dozens of Sherman tanks. The Tigers stood their ground. Hit after hit bounced off. A British officer later described it. It was like throwing pebbles at a fortress wall. We hit them and hit them. Nothing happened. Hill 112 was only taken when the Tigers withdrew. Not because they were defeated, but because they were needed elsewhere. This is the reality that Aberdeen Proving Ground tested. This is the reality that remained secret for 50 years. The Americans developed tactics to compensate. They attacked in groups. They tried to catch Tigers from the side. They used the terrain. They called in air support, but these tactics came at a cost. A human cost. Every attempt to outflank a Tiger meant exposure. Every second in the open was deadly. The reports also reveal something else, something rarely discussed: the psychological impact of the Tiger. American prisoners of war were interrogated. Captured German soldiers were interrogated. Both sides said the same thing. The Tiger had an aura, a presence. American soldiers sometimes fled at the mere sight of it. Before a shot was even fired, the Germans called it Tiger panic. The Americans had no name for it, but they experienced it. A single Tiger could paralyze an entire American unit, not through fire, through fear. The Aberdeen reports explained why. An average American soldier didn't know that his Sherman was outmatched, but he felt it. Instinctively. When he saw a Tiger, he knew he could die, and often. He was right. The release of the documents in 1995 sparked a debate that continues to this day. Was the secrecy justified? Some say yes. Morale had to be protected. The soldiers had to be able to fight. The truth would have paralyzed them. Others say no. The truth would have put pressure on leadership. Better tanks would have arrived sooner. Lives would have been saved. Who is right? The statistics speak volumes. 648 Shermans in a division. Over 600 dead and wounded, while the Pershing sat stateside. But history is never that simple. The production of the Pershing was complicated. The logistics were difficult. Maybe it really couldn't have arrived any sooner. But let me show you the counter-arguments. The Pershing was tested in September 1943. The first 20 vehicles were ready in December 1944. It took 15 months from approval to deployment. Why so long? General Leslie McNair, the man who shaped American ground forces doctrine. He believed that tanks should not fight tanks. That's what tank destroyers were for. The tank destroyer doctrine, an American invention. The idea? Light, fast vehicles with big guns. They would destroy enemy tanks from ambush. In theory, it sounded good. In practice, it was a disaster. The tank destroyers had no armor. They were vulnerable. Against Tigers, they had one chance. If they missed, they were dead. And they often did miss. McNair died in July 1944, a victim of friendly fire in Normandy. But his doctrine lived on. The Pershing remained in America. Only after his death did things start to move. Only then was the Pershing prioritized. Only then did the first vehicles reach Europe, but 15 months delayed, thousands of deaths, because of a doctrine that worked on paper, but not on the battlefield. The Aberdeen reports would have challenged this doctrine. They showed clearly that tank destroyers could fight Tigers, but they also showed that many would die trying. An M10 Wolverine had a 76mm gun, the same as the upgunned Sherman, against the Tiger. Useless from the front, from the side, maybe, at close range, with luck. An M18 Hellcat was faster, but even more thinly armored. An 88mm hit meant instant death, no chance to escape. The tank destroyer doctrine worked against Panzers III and IV, against the Tiger. It was suicide, but that wasn't in the official training manuals. That was in the classified reports that no one read. What we know is this: the Aberdeen reports were classified, the truth was withheld, and men died in tanks they thought were good enough. That is the legacy of the Tiger tests. That is the legacy of 50 years of secrecy. But let me show you something else. Something that completes the story. The Tiger at Aberdeen Proving Ground stands today at Fort Benning, renamed Fort Moore, the same vehicle that was tested in 1944, with the same markings, with the same impact points from the tests. Every American tank officer can see it. Everyone can learn the story. Everyone can understand what happened back then. But the complete reports, they weren't released until 1995, 50 years later, when most of the veterans were already dead. The men who died in Shermans never learned the full truth. Their families never learned it. Only their grandchildren could read the documents. That is the true legacy of the Tiger tests. Not just technical data, not just penetration values, but a question that every generation must answer anew. What is the truth worth, and what does it cost to suppress it? The answer lies in the Aberdeen reports, in the losses of the 3rd Armoured Division, in the names in cemeteries from Normandy to Belgium. The truth cost nothing. It was there. Suppressing it cost everything. Now I'd like to show you one final aspect. What did America learn from the Tiger tests? After the war, American tank doctrine changed radically. The M26 Pershing became the standard. Then came the M46 Patton, then the M47, then the M48, then the M60. Each of these tanks had a 90mm gun, or larger. Each had thicker armor. Each was designed to be equal to the Tiger. And then came the M1 Abrams. The Abrams carries a 120mm gun, German technology, licensed from Rheinmetall, the same company that would have perfected the Tiger's gun if the war had lasted longer. The armor? Chobham, a British-American development, based on research that began after the war. Influenced by what was learned from the Tiger, the Abrams is the spiritual heir to the Tiger, not genetically, but conceptually. A heavy tank with superior firepower, with thicker armor, designed to dominate every engagement. This is the true legacy of the Aberdeen tests. Not just classified documents, but the realization that quantity alone isn't enough, that quality counts, that a superior tank is worth more than 10 inferior ones. But let me shed light on another aspect, one that's rarely mentioned. The role of information in modern warfare. The Aberdeen tests weren't just technical analyses. They were intelligence, knowledge about the enemy. And that knowledge wasn't shared. It was hoarded. It was hidden. It was classified. Why? partly for security reasons. If the Germans knew what the Americans knew, they could react. They could change their tactics. They could fix weaknesses, but the Germans already knew their Tigers were superior. That wasn't a secret. It was obvious to anyone who saw a Tiger in action. What the Americans kept secret wasn't the strength of the Tiger, it was the weakness of the Sherman tank. And that is the real scandal. The American leadership knew their tank crews were riding into death traps. They knew it from the Aberdeen tests. They knew it from combat reports. They knew it from casualty statistics. But they did nothing. They changed nothing. They continued sending their men into Shermans. Today, we'd call that something else. We'd call it negligent homicide, but in 1944, they called it wartime necessity. The vulnerability analysis that Aberdeen created was detailed. They showed where to hit to penetrate. The tracks, the running gear, the rear with only 80 millimeters instead of 100. But how do you get to the rear? The Tiger had to be outflanked. That meant exposure. That meant casualties. The recommendations were clear: never attack head-on, operate in groups, request air support. But these recommendations reached the front too slowly. Many crews learned these lessons only in combat. Some died before they had the chance. That's the tragedy of secrecy. The Germans, by the way, reacted to the Allied tests. The Tiger II, the King Tiger, 150 millimeters of frontal armor. The longer 88 millimeter K/UK-43. On Christmas Eve 1944, American soldiers captured Tiger 332 in the Battle of the Bulge. It was brought to Aberdeen. The results were even more frightening than with the Tiger I. The 150 millimeters of frontal armor resisted everything. The 90 millimeter gun of the Pershing, the British 17-pounder, only the 122 millimeter gun of the Soviet IS-2 could penetrate. But the Tiger II came too late. Only about 490 were built, too few to influence the war. Would the war have lasted longer? The Aberdeen reports show that the Americans were concerned, very concerned. The Tiger II was a glimpse into a future in which American tanks would become even more irrelevant. That explains the urgency after the war. The Cold War began. The Soviets developed the T-44, then the T-54, each generation better. The Americans knew they had to keep up. The Aberdeen experience had taught them what happens when you're technically inferior. So they built the M46, the M47, the M48, the M60, each generation heavier, each generation stronger. And finally, the Abrams, which resembles a Tiger more than a Sherman. The Sherman was cheap. The Sherman was quick to produce. The Sherman was everywhere. But against a Tiger, the Sherman was a coffin on tracks. The American leadership learned that lesson. Late, too late for many, but they learned it. And today, the Abrams dominates every battlefield it appears on. Like the Tiger back then, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But let me show you one last parallel. Ukraine, 2024. Leopard 2 tanks fighting against Russian T-72s and T-90s. The Germans supplied Leopard 2A4s and 2A6. Western tanks versus Soviet design. What do we see? The Leopards survive hits that would destroy Russian tanks. Western armor is better. Western fire control is more precise. But the Russians have something the Germans didn't have in 1944. Drones, precision missiles, modern anti-tank weapons. A Leopard that's visible will be destroyed. No matter how thick its armor is, the lessons of 1944 no longer fully apply. The Aberdeen testers of 1944 would be amazed. The tanks are better than ever. But they're no longer the kings of the battlefield. Nevertheless, one lesson remains, a lesson that Aberdeen taught and Ukraine confirms. Quality counts more than quantity. The Russians have lost thousands of tanks, over 3,000 documented. Why? Poor training. Poor tactics, poor leadership. The same mistakes the Americans made in 1944, just the other way around. Back then, the Americans had the mass, but not the quality. Today, the Russians have the mass, but not the quality. History rhymes. And the Aberdeen reports, they were never officially translated. They were never fully published. They're stored in archives, digitized, but barely read. If you want to see the original documents, you can request them from the National Archives, NARA, Record Group 156, Aberdeen Proving Ground Records. There are hundreds of pages, technical details, penetration diagrams, recommendations, everything that was secret for 50 years, and everything that could have saved men's lives. That's the final lesson, the most important. Knowledge saves lives, but only if it's shared. The Aberdeen engineers shared their knowledge. They wrote reports. They made recommendations. The generals in Washington didn't share it. They classified it. They hid it. They decided who would live and who would die. 80 years later, we can judge their decisions. And most historians come to the same conclusion. They were wrong. The secrecy didn't save lives, it cost them. That's the legacy of the Tiger tests. That's what you should take away from this video. Write me in the comments. Did you know about the classified Tiger tests? Do you think the secrecy was justified? Should the soldiers have been told the truth? I'm curious about your opinion. Share this video with someone who's interested in military history. The truth deserves to be heard. And if you want to see more of these forgotten military stories, then subscribe to this channel. Activate the bell to not miss any new documentation. Every day, new insights emerge into the technology that decided wars and shaped history. The Aberdeen Proving Ground reports are just waiting to be read. The story is just waiting to be told. And you, yes you, are now part of those who know it. Until next time.